Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, with inflation running at a 40-year high, Londoners on the brink are relying on food banks to feed their families. Freedom's Ark Community Church in Tottenham, led by Pastor Nimza Bungay, opened their doors to Channel's Business Global earlier this week, revealing the real impact of the cost of living crisis in one of the richest countries in the world. And the UK's Health Security Agency has procured more than 20,000 doses of a smallpox vaccine as monkeypox infections spread across Europe. Dr. Philip Idayawo, a pathologist working at Basildon and Thurrock University Hospital, will be joining me to assess the seriousness of this latest public health emergency. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's have a look at a topic that has dominated headlines here in the UK this week: Partygate. Following the damning publication of senior civil servant Sue Gray's report over illegal parties that took place in Downing Street during lockdown, Prime Minister Boris Johnson denied the suggestion that he lied to Parliament. So far, less than 20 backbench Conservative MPs have publicly called for the Prime Minister to quit. It is unclear how many have submitted letters of no confidence in Boris Johnson, with 54 required to trigger a vote by the parliamentary party on his leadership.
I'm grateful to Sue Gray for her report today, and I want to thank her for the work that she's done. I also thank the Metropolitan Police for completing their investigation, and I want to begin today by renewing my apology to the House, to the whole country, for the short lunchtime gathering on the 19th of June 2020 in the Cabinet Room, during which I stood at my place at the Cabinet table and for which I received a fixed penalty notice. And I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, above all, that I take full responsibility for everything that took place on my watch.
That report lays bare the rot that under this Prime Minister has spread in Number 10. And it provides definitive proof of how those within the building treated the sacrifices of the British people with utter contempt. When the dust settles and the anger subsides, this report will stand as a monument to the hubris and the arrogance of a government that believed it was one rule for them and another rule for everyone else.
The Prime Minister was engaging in drinking and debauchery that makes a mockery of the gut-wrenching sacrifices that each and every person made. Will the Prime Minister now take the opportunity and resign?
Earlier, I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for some analysis. Simon, Sue Gray report finally published in full. It appears as if at this stage there is no longer a police investigation. Big question, is he going to get away with it?
I think it looks like at the moment that he is. I think what really helped him was that this has been staggered over several months. You've had the Sue Gray report taking place and then not being published because then the police had to investigate and then they fined and then this, and it's kind of come out, and then in between that you've had the war in Russia and the, a lot of rise in living costs, which has taken attention away from the story really. At the moment there are about 17 MPs that we know of who've put their letters forward to the committee, but they need 52 people to do that, and I don't think that's going to happen because, as outraged as everyone was yesterday by some of the details, and some of the details in the Sue Gray report are pretty damning, wine, cheese, beer and pizza, someone drinking so much they threw up, a minor altercation or basically a little fight happening. These were sort of drunken parties. There's no getting away from that. Staff leaving the building in the middle of the night.
Some sleeping over.
Yeah, exactly. And three Conservative MPs have, since that report was published yesterday, they have put in their letters, so there was a little bit of movement there, but you need a lot more than that to get to your 52 from 17. So I think what's helped Boris is that he's done well with the Ukraine issue, and he seems to be on top of that. And then today, Rishi Sunak coming out and talking about the cost of living and how energy prices, how they're going to help people with this new grant of £10 billion going to people to help them pay their energy bills. So they're kind of, there are other things to talk about at the moment. If we remember back a couple of months ago, this was the only story that people were talking about, and how can Boris Johnson possibly ever get away with this? And there are photos and there's more leaks and things. I'm sure there will be more things that will come out, but I think there just needs to be another angle or another thing for people to get outraged about for this to then move into that 52 votes.
Has it damaged his popularity, though?
I think it definitely has, and you saw that in the local elections where the Conservatives did badly and Labour did pretty well. And I think there probably is going to be you will see that at the ballot box come the next general election. I just think at the moment Conservative MPs think that it's more likely people will vote for the Conservatives because of Boris Johnson than they would do otherwise. You know, it's probably more likely people are going to vote for Boris Johnson than for another leader. There doesn't seem to be an obvious candidate waiting in the wings who's more popular than Boris Johnson. I think he does still, up and down the country, have a lot of support because he's this straight-talking guy who's quite charming and who got Brexit done, and people like that. So I think there will have to be, you know, some other scandal that will come out, but it's Boris Johnson, and that could be
that could have happened already. Yeah, exactly.
It can happen at any stage. So I think at the moment, unfortunately, for the opposition parties who are obviously calling for his resignation based on the fact that he's been fined, he's the only, serving prime minister to break the law. But despite that, I just don't think there's enough outrage in the Conservative wings, and I don't think people up and down the country are as, angry about it as they once were. And it's an issue that you can be angry at because, of course, people didn't go to funerals, people didn't go to hospitals to see dying relatives, and yet they were partying at the same time. But I think just this staggered, the way it's happened, the way it's been dealt with, has saved him, because time is a good healer, and there's lots of other things going on in the world that takes media attention away.
Absolutely, although I do think we're going to be talking about this scandal for weeks and weeks to come, unfortunately. Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Let's change gears now. After weeks of pressure from all sides of the political divide, the British Chancellor has unveiled a £15 billion package of support to assist households struggling with the cost of living crisis. As UK inflation reached a 40-year high last week, food banks up and down the country are reporting of the heartbreaking hardship staff and volunteers witness every day as people grapple with feeding their families and heating their homes. Freedom's Ark Community Church in Tottenham, led by Pastor Nims Obunge, runs a community food hub 3 days a week, providing nutritionally balanced emergency food to the local community. Earlier this week, they opened their doors to Channel's Business Global, providing us some exclusive insight into the real cost of living crisis impacting ordinary Londoners.
This is what you call a pop-up food bank. It's been here a few years, but the good thing about these new food banks, no questions asked. They don't care who you are. You don't need to get authorization from anyone. You just turn up and they'll help you.
In 2001, I was run over by a car, which is the old scar there, and it just left me potless with nothing. And I've been just trying to get by as much as I can on the benefits and whatnot, which a lot of the time don't seem to be beneficial.
I mean, for me personally, if I didn't have the food bank right now, because I'm struggling quite a lot for the past few months, I don't know what I'd do.
This is a mixed people. It started about 3 years ago, and at that time I was just on a radio, I was listening to Radio 4, and I heard children in our communities were going to school without having a meal. And I remember that was never my experience. As a kid, I never went to school without eating, unless I chose not to. And so we worked with schools all across our community to say, if you needed support as a church, we would provide that support. And then, fast forward, we had COVID and people being furloughed. And the whole tension was around how people would survive such a difficult, season. We started with just a few hundred coming, and then it went from 500 to 1,000, and the numbers kept going up. And it was a service that was provided once a week. We only did it on a Saturday. By the time things got really serious, we were doing it on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, and our numbers were going through the roof. We were getting up to 150 to nearly 200 people at a go. So we had to spread our service opportunity to accommodate this. And now, with the cost of living crisis, which is really challenging for so many families, some of whom I'm sure you've had the privilege of speaking with, our desire is just, the numbers again have gone up again, but what we're trying to do is to ensure that no matter what happens, we are in a position where we can meet the needs of our community and never have to turn one person back. What we have is some of our service users have their electricity on payment meters, and they can only afford so many pounds to take them through the week. And what happens is when that meter runs out, they have to go to candles. Now, we speak about being in the United Kingdom, and we're dealing with people having to use candles in their homes. I want us to understand that that is an anomaly in our situation. It's also very difficult for folks to be able to have 3 square meals a day. And so they're having to decide what meals are the best taken and how much they can give their children. And so with the cost of living crisis, with the gas rates going up, electricity rates going up, food rates going up, people just have to pick and choose what's best for their family. And poverty is real. Poverty is real in this community, and we have, we were looking at this, we have people from 17 to 18 different boroughs that come here to collect food. So they're not all just from Haringey or Tottenham. And then we have folks who are not just only British, we have people from every cultural background you can imagine. We're having to have language translators. And you have refugees who've come in. We've had people from Ukraine who have just come in, but they've not got the support to live. And they're refugees and they're needing that support. So we have people from so many different backgrounds struggling to make ends meet. And we just happen to be that stopgap that provides that food, and we provide other support structures for them. I have a deep concern when you have political rhetoric without the reality. And often that rhetoric is driven by a position of policy that's not based upon the practical experience of Londoners or, dare I say, Great Britain. Politicians, unfortunately, have not really had the experience quite often of the layman on the streets. And I was listening to a government minister who remains nameless, who said, you know, when he was challenged about the cost of living crisis, his response was, well, you know, folks need to learn how to cook better. And if they cook better, they'll be able to spread their food. And I thought, how could you talk about cooking, learning how to cook better in order to survive? That's not the issue right here. Another one said, well, we have many support groups. We'll provide, you know, just get in touch with the support groups in your area. That in itself does not provide the solution. I think there needs to be an injection of funds, pretty much like the government did when we had the furlough system. What they did was, we knew we were dealing with a crisis in our nation, and what happened was and the £20 uplift is great, but we need more than that. We need an injection of capital into our economy in order to address this present crisis. Now, without a doubt, the war in Ukraine, the tensions with what's going on with gas prices and Russia has impacted and will impact on us. But we as a nation, as an economy, have a backup resource in order to support moments like this. And I would be appealing to the government to consider the challenge that we have right now in our communities and inject more cash into the economy in order to support the most vulnerable.
Later in the show, I'll be speaking with Chimezie Emuelu, the CEO of Seamfix Limited, and pathologist Dr. Philip Idayawo. But until then, here's some of this week's biggest business news stories for you. The first Elizabeth Line train left London's Paddington Station at 6:33 a.m. on Tuesday morning. The new network, formerly called Crossrail, is promising to slash journey times for millions of Londoners and transform travel across the capital. The 73-mile line cost over £18 billion and will increase London's rail capacity by 10%. The Samsung Group has announced plans to raise spending by roughly $360 billion over the next 5 years as the tech giant expands into the pharmaceutical sector. The investment is expected to create 80,000 jobs. In a statement, bosses said the strategic move will drive long-term growth in areas that also include semiconductor chip manufacturing. Samsung did not include electric vehicle batteries as a future growth engine. Sri Lanka's newly appointed Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe will double up as a finance minister, leading bailout talks with the International Monetary Fund. Earlier this week, the World Bank said it is not planning to provide any new financing to the country until an adequate economic policy framework has been put in place. Sri Lanka is currently going through its worst economic crisis since its independence in 1948, as COVID-19 ravaged the country's lucrative tourism industry and ill-timed tax cuts drained government coffers. Poor coverage distribution, a lack of digital infrastructure and the high cost of usage are just a few reasons as to why Africa still lags the rest of the world in widespread internet adoption. With a thriving ecosystem of tech startups attracting billions of dollars in investment onto the continent, companies such as Seamfix Limited are doing their utmost to make sure Africa is prepared for its digital revolution. Chimezie Emuelu is the Seamfix CEO and he joins me now from Wokingham in England for more on this. Mr. Chimezie Emuelu, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. I've kind of spelled out for the audience some of the obvious issues that's preventing a thorough expansion of internet use across the continent. But I know you've got more experience than me. What are some of the stumbling blocks and why are we still facing them?
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you so much for having me. You see, one of the key critical challenges we have in Africa with respect to financial inclusion especially is identity, being able to identify people. I mean, I watched the last episode where you mentioned that over 57% of Africans are not included in the financial ecosystem. But then if you think about it, if you narrow it down to a country like Nigeria that has over 200 million people with over 80 million of them being registered into the digital space, you now realize that that's around 40% of the entire country. So if you extrapolate it to Africa, you don't have much more than that volume that you have for the financial inclusion. So you see the real challenge in terms of adoption of technology, in terms of getting people to be included, is the fact that you don't have a proper digital ecosystem, digital identity infrastructure to power all that.
Yeah, please continue.
Well, so basically what I'm saying is there is need for a proper digital ID infrastructure that has interconnected Africa to be able to launch Africa into that kind of digital economy.
That's a great analysis and actually leads pretty well into my next question because, of course, we're not doing too badly in some areas. You know, look at the thriving tech ecosystem. We've had so many of those CEOs on this show over the past a few months, many of them getting millions upon millions of dollars of investment from Silicon Valley tech titans, but they can't do it on their own. Do you think there now needs to be a proper government intervention to ensure that in some of these rural communities, people are being ID'd? There is a thorough identification so that we know who these individuals are and we can get them online. There's one good thing having platforms like Paystack and Flutterwave doing the best that they can, but do they need more intervention from the state?
Yeah, I believe the government needs to be a bit more deliberate, very, very deliberate. And there are actually a lot of work is going on. They need to be way more deliberate in terms of ensuring that every singular person must be identified. Because even in my company, Seamfix, we believe that identity is a right, it's not a privilege. Everybody deserves equal access to opportunities. And that starts with being having the clear identification platform that can enable people to be identified properly. So if you look at it from a Pan-African perspective, especially from the fact that we have over 54 countries that needs to come together to put together a proper ID infrastructure that can interconnect. So if you want to have a continent that is prosperous, a continent that is fully included in the digital ecosystem, you need to make it a trading continent. And that's Afrexim Bank through PAPS has started something similar, but now there needs to be a much more deliberate effort to harmonizing all the ID infrastructure such that you can track financing of terrorism when transactions move across borders. You can be able to have way more companies or fintechs that can be able to easily identify people and verify them onto services in the snap of a finger.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing that we're not there yet, but we are running out of time. Before I let you go, Chimezie, I do want to ask what lessons have been learned by firms, particularly clients of SeamFix, during the pandemic. I would, cross my fingers saying that we are kind of in a post-pandemic era. What lessons have been learned about the digital transformation and Africa's potential digital revolution?
I think the biggest learning, the biggest point that has been passed across very loudly is the fact that we are no longer prisoners of geography. Post-COVID pandemic, pre-COVID, if I were to have this conversation with you, I'll need to show up in your studio. But right now we're having it online. So we're no longer we're no longer prisoners of geography. So what that has also translated to most of our customers is that they are now realizing that their competition is no longer local. Their competition is now global. So they are now much more deliberate in ensuring that the talents that are localized in their areas are now getting more global exposures. There's a lot of learning actually, but in terms of the ID infrastructure, people are now taking the conversations way more seriously, because for somebody like me, when I came to the UK and set up SeamFix in the UK, it took me 3 months to open a bank account because there's no ID infrastructure for people to be able to verify organizations. To rent a house, I had to pay 12 months rent in advance. But now Africa is being more deliberate in putting together this ID infrastructure that the rest of the world can integrate to and connect to.
Yeah, it's so important. Thank you, Chimezie Emuelu, CEO of SeamFix Limited. And next time, I'd rather have you in the studio if you don't mind. So do come and join us on Channels Business Global again. Thank you, Chimezie. Now to our final topic. The UK's Health Security Agency has procured more than 20,000 doses of a smallpox vaccine as cases of monkeypox rise in Europe and around the world. Initial symptoms include fever, headache, muscle aches, swollen lymph nodes, chills and exhaustion. Authorities are advising those at the highest risk to isolate for 21 days once symptoms appear. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Dr. Philip Idayawar, a pathologist working at Basildon and Thurrock University Hospital. Can you explain exactly what it is and whether or not we should be concerned?
Yes, thanks for having me. I think as an infectious disease, yes, we should be concerned because it's an infectious disease and it means that it can spread. For people with weakened immunity, it could be much more severe if you compare that to those with good immune status. But I think that in terms of making the diagnosis and recognizing this disease, it is to say that in the early phases, it is just going to be non-specific. For people, fever, body aches, headaches, just feeling unwell in the early phases. But once the bumps breaks out, they are rather, usually in the faces and hands. These are the places where they break out. But even that is not specific. I think what differentiates the monkeypox from, say, for instance, chickenpox is that one, chickenpox itches a lot. Two, and more specifically, monkeypox tend to have enlarged lymph nodes, that is glands in the axilla, in the neck, places like that. Those are the things that will really distinguish it. However, as you will have noted with some of the reportings, you talk about it being more common now in the present outbreak amongst people, the homosexual community, which I think is because of the peculiar nature of close contact transmission. I think that is why this is happening. I don't think, personally, and from the science of this virus that it is anything to do with any specific nature of this virus.
Dr. Philip Idaiwo, a pathologist at Basildon and Thurrock University Hospital, thank you so much for taking up your time to talk with us. We'll talk to you again soon. Thank you, Dr. Philip. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.